Hi guys, I decided to give this format a try to talk about my Legendary Lives debrief thoughts a little bit. Uh, Bear with me for any presentation faults. I'm not super used to this stuff. But anyway, Ron gave me a prompt in saying that he thought Christabel's character generation result was, what does he say here? Probably at the least coherent or automatically motivated outcome I've seen for the game. And whether Rod agrees, Rod does agree. I think the problems I was having, I think the sort of the frustration I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the game with the sort of sprawling melodramatic backstory that I created was from the feeling that I was sort of trying to lay pipe between all of these events that were hard to put together, and these different. It didn't help that I sort of overcommitted to explaining every little triviality of the character by way of the backstory, but the feeling that I was, like I said, laying pipe between all these different things instead of finding one shining center that made sense. It didn't feel like that happened for me. The one thing that I really sort of wish especially is that I had just vetoed the agoraphobia result, which at the time it happened was baffling and a little frustrating, but I sort of thought, I'm taking this ride, so I'll go with it, and now that I've taken the ride, I sort of think the idea is no implementation of random mental illness or disorder tables in any role-playing game that I've seen has struck me as a particularly good idea. So that's something that if I were to make another Legendary Lives character and I got one of those results, I honestly think I would just skip it and roll again. That's where I'm at with that. But in terms of how that, where was I going to go with this? In terms of how that shook out in play, I think that's partly kept me on feeling like I was on the back foot a lot of times in terms of what Christabel was supposed to be doing, and sort of seizing on the just get out of here objective in the opening act of, I guess, of the game was a way of it provided a way to motivate Christabel that was immediate and compelling for me, I guess. The backstory stuff, I think I've said this before, but the backstory stuff with the Bleeding Heart militia and things that were happening in Smith City, I didn't pick up on that because it feels like we've gone over this before, but as we've said, at the time I was grappling with the idea of doing things in the game, and the sort of the realization that having a good stat wasn't necessarily. It was pretty hard to see the relation between how the dice worked and what your character could expect in terms of having agency or power. And just literally a lot of stuff was going on in the early parts of the game, and I was still sort of focused on this, narrow it down one thing at a time idea. So that's how that all went down for me, I think, in the beginning of the game. One thing I haven't mentioned before, and I think it's just because the thought briefly crossed my mind during the early Tourmaline games, and then it came back to mind after we finished, is, I guess the completed version of this thought is that thing at the end where you've got this idea that Christabel is this sort of charmingly ditzy little small business owner in a town who suddenly her hard-bitten, mysterious past comes back to haunt her. That feels like almost that should have been the beginning of her story instead of the end of it. But for some reason, when I was making the character, it didn't even occur to me that that was a way I could position her. You know, I think in the backstory I just started like at the end, well, all this stuff happened to her. Now she's ready for adventure somewhere, some way. You figure it out, Ross. And I guess that's just almost feels kind of like an original sin of imagination. But I don't think, and I'm trying to figure out what I was responding to. I mean, both Shining Star and Girl were sort of in these, I think we're in sort of the same kind of nebulous drifter situations. And a little interruption here with some art you haven't seen before as a free bonus. That wasn't really well said, I don't think. I had to go back and look at the original backstories to sort of try to figure out what I was talking about. And I guess it's just that sort of the kind of end state for Shining Star said that she was sort of had received this stipend and was kind of in limbo trying to figure out what to do next. And like, I'm not talking about like it's clear that she had something to do next. It's just more of a question of her being positioned as outside of society, and Girl was kind of that way too. She ran to freedom and just what would she do next. And I may have just imitated that in a monkey see, monkey do way, I don't know, without really being clear about how that, what am I trying to say? Without really thinking about whether that was the right play for the kind of character I wanted this to be. The book didn't really suggest anything to do with how you position your character starting out, apart from, you know, buy some equipment so you'll be ready for adventure. And I guess that's what I responded to. And I think, you know, if I were to do another character, I would think a little more seriously about what my options are for positioning the character I were to make. You know, maybe they do have a social position and we can start from there, as opposed to just lone drifting adventurer. So that I think covers what I have to say about that part of the whole thing. I want to talk a little about magic and miracles, maybe. Robbie had mentioned that we were restrained in our use of miracles, and for me, I think that restraint was because I sort of didn't know what to do with it, or didn't feel like it didn't feel like it felt like it went with the character that I was making or playing. And it also, I actually looked at the fortification miracles as a possible solution to getting more juice into your rolls. But the thing is, the result of the fortification miracle is that you get +2 column shifts to your next roll. And like the thing I immediately imagined was just like rolling an amazing 99 on your fortification roll. Awesome. All right, you get 2 column shifts on your next roll, and it's a 12 or something, and so it's still garbage even with the column shifts. And I just thought if that happened, it would just be so frustrating and feel so bad that it made me never want to do a fortification miracle. And so that's just a particular observation I had about that one element. As far as the other miracles, I think I really only remember using them in a utilitarian way when we were just sort of like grasping for ways to... Anytime we were just grasping for ways to get out of a situation, I think a couple of times I was like, oh, fuck it, let's try a miracle and see if we can just shortcut around this. But I don't know if that's the most evocative of myth and fantasy way to think of miracles in this game. So I guess I'll say I struck out on figuring out what to do with that part. Magic, again, I think we talked about this in the game and how I sort of had to come up with this sort of explanation for how Christabel's magic was kind of, she sort of was or wasn't consciously doing it. So if I rolled the dice and it failed, then like she didn't actually do it. It wasn't like she tried to wiggle her fingers and cast the spell and nothing happens. And I mean, that was just a response to the fact that it felt like more times than not, nothing would happen. Dice being how they are, it happened spectacularly at least once with the snake. But it's weird. I mean, I have a question for someone who's read every fantasy book there is, if anyone of that description is out there, Ron. Is there any book where, like, you've got some sort of wizard, sorcerer protagonist who tells us that, magic is fickle and uncertain of success, and we see that in action, like it sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't, and it's not farcical? Like, I just don't know. Maybe I... Because I can think of things like the spell at the beginning of the Worm Ouroboros, where there's all this tension and suspense about whether it's going to happen or not. But it does happen because the author made it happen, right? So, like, what I'm curious about is whether we ever see in any novel or story someone who is batting 50% and it's not a joke. So that's just a question I have about that aspect of it. I think that's it for now, and so I'll just post this on YouTube and put a link into the thread on Adept Play and see what people have to say. Thanks for watching.